Daniel Reyes knocked on the yellow door the way he always did. 2 soft knocks, then a pause, then a third knock a little louder, so Eleanor Whitfield would have time to get her cane under her before she stood up. He had a grocery bag in one hand, her heart pills, a carton of eggs, the peppermint tea she liked, and a foil-wrapped plate of banana muffins in the other, still warm from his own oven. It was 6:40 in the evening, same as every evening for the last 7 months. Footsteps came toward the door. Wrong footsteps. Fast, even, confident. Not Eleanor's slow shuffle and tap. Daniel's stomach dropped half a second before the door swung open. A woman stood in the frame in a slate-gray blazer, a phone still glowing in her hand, one earbud dangling loose, like she'd yanked it out mid-sentence. For a moment, neither of them said a word. Daniel knew that face. He'd seen it on a company badge that used to open a door of his own, a much bigger door, in a much bigger building, 40 minutes from here. Vivian Whitfield, Chief Executive Officer of Whitfield Dynamics, the woman whose signature sat at the bottom of the letter that had ended his career 11 months ago. "You," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Where's Ellie?" Daniel asked, because his daughter Mia's babysitting window closed in 40 minutes, and because some part of his brain refused to process anything else until he knew the old woman was safe. "Napping," she said. "Her neighbor stops by around now with muffins." Vivian's eyes moved from his face to the foil-wrapped plate, and something in her expression cracked open. Not fear exactly, more like the floor tilting under a person who thought they knew which room they were standing in. "You're the neighbor." Before either of them could say another word, they both heard it. The creak of the recliner in the front room, and Eleanor's voice calling out, cheerful and completely unaware that she'd just introduced the 2 most complicated people in her life to each other for the 2nd time. "Vivi, honey, is that Daniel?" "Let the man in. Don't just stand there gawking." Neither of them moved. "Before we get to what happens next, because trust me, this gets messier before it gets better, you need to understand how a man with an engineering degree and 11 years of experience ended up delivering muffins to a stranger's grandmother 6 evenings a week. So let's back up. 6 months and 1 soccer ball before any of this. Millbrook, Oregon didn't have much going on. A hardware store, a diner called the Copper Spoon, a public school with a leaking roof the district kept promising to fix. Daniel Reyes had picked it on purpose 11 months ago, the way a person picks a town off a map, because nobody there knows the name Whitfield Dynamics, and nobody there is going to ask him why a man with his resume is patching drywall for a living. He rented the small blue house on Larkspur Lane and got a job doing general maintenance for a property management company that ran 4 apartment buildings on the north side of town. Leaky faucets, broken garbage disposals, a stuck window in Unit 4C that fought him every single week like it had a grudge against summer. It wasn't the life anyone would have predicted for him. Not from the way he talked, careful, precise, the way people talk when they're used to being taken seriously in a meeting. Not from the certifications still sitting in a folder in his closet that nobody in Millbrook had ever asked to see. His daughter Mia was 8, gap-toothed, obsessed with drawing horses that all had suspiciously human eyes. Every morning he walked her the 5 blocks to Millbrook Elementary. Every afternoon he walked back past a small yellow house with a wraparound porch and a rose bed that had, 3 weeks after they moved in, become the unfortunate landing zone for one of Mia's soccer kicks. Eleanor Whitfield had come out onto that porch, expecting to scold a child, and instead laughed so hard she had to sit back down in her rocking chair. She was 79, sharp-eyed, and lived alone. Her husband gone 14 years. Her only son overseas with the Foreign Service. Her granddaughter, as far as Daniel understood it, running some big company 2 hours south and calling every Sunday for exactly 10 minutes before something always came up. "She works too hard," Eleanor told him once, stirring honey into her tea. "For what?" I ask her. "Come see the house," I tell her. "I'm not getting any younger, Vivian." Daniel had nodded along the way. You nod at a story that isn't really about you. He didn't know anything about corporate boardrooms anymore. He didn't want to. He'd shut that door the day security walked him out of a glass building with his badge still clipped to a lanyard he wasn't allowed to keep. He never mentioned it. Not to Eleanor. Not to Mia, who was too young to remember much about the old house anyway. Not to anyone in Millbrook. As far as this town knew, Daniel Reyes had always fixed leaking faucets for a living, and some nights, that felt like the better trade. Other nights, it felt like a wound he'd learned to walk around instead of let heal. He was digging through a closet box for packing tape one evening in March, when his hand caught the edge of something stiff and laminated, wedged behind a folder of old insurance paperwork. He pulled it out without thinking. His own face looked back at him, younger, clean-shaven, a company logo in the corner, and underneath it, in small block letters, Senior Quality Assurance Engineer, Battery Systems Division. He sat down hard on the closet floor. 11 years at Whitfield Dynamics. The last 4 of them running thermal safety validation on the company's flagship EV battery cell line. The one that had put the company on magazine covers and made its stock triple in 3 years. The night he'd found the numbers that didn't add up. A batch of cells cleared for shipment with a thermal tolerance reading that should have failed inspection outright. The report he'd filed, the meeting where his director's face had gone very still and very careful. The weeks after, when files he'd never touched turned up flagged under his login. The termination letter, with a signature at the bottom that had meant nothing to him at the time. Just a name, V. Whitfield. He remembered standing in the parking garage with a cardboard box of desk photos, watching coworkers he'd trained suddenly find their phones very interesting. He remembered telling himself he'd fight it, and then remembering Mia's school fees, the mortgage, and how fighting a company with an in-house legal team was a luxury built for people who still had savings. Nobody had asked him for his side. Nobody, apparently, had needed to. A signature had done all the talking required, and everyone downstream of that signature had simply believed what they were told to believe. And now that same signature was standing in Eleanor Whitfield's doorway, staring at him like he was a ghost. Vivian stepped back from the doorway first. "You'd better come in," she said, voice tight, "before she wonders why we're both standing here like idiots." Daniel walked past her into the front hallway he knew as well as his own house. The creaky third floorboard, the smell of Eleanor's lavender candles, the wall of photographs that he'd looked at 100 times without ever connecting the smiling toddler in the graduation gown photo to the woman who'd fired him. Eleanor was in her recliner, delighted and completely oblivious. "There he is, Vivi. This is Daniel, from down on Larkspur. Fixes half this street's plumbing, and still finds time to feed an old woman. Daniel, this is my granddaughter I keep telling you about. Finally decided to visit her poor grandmother. We've actually met," Vivian said carefully, sitting on the arm of the sofa, her eyes never leaving Daniel. "Oh?" Eleanor perked up. "Small world." "Small world," Daniel agreed, setting the muffins down on the side table with hands that were steadier than he felt. He stayed the usual 20 minutes, checked Eleanor's pill organizer, changed a porch light bulb that had been out for 2 days, listened to her tell the same story about her late husband's fishing boat that she told at least once a week. Vivian sat through all of it, with the stiff posture of someone waiting for a verdict, watching Daniel move through her grandmother's house with an ease that clearly unsettled her more than anger would have. When he finally said his goodbyes, she followed him out onto the porch. How long, she said quietly, once the door was shut behind them. "Have you been coming here?" 7 months. Daniel kept his voice level. "Little over. It's not what you think. I don't know what to think. You were terminated from my company for a data security violation. And now you're—" She gestured vaguely at the muffins, the porch, the whole domestic scene. Something in Daniel went very quiet and very cold. "I was terminated," he said, "for flagging a thermal tolerance failure on the Series 4 battery cell line that your company shipped anyway. Whatever's written in my file, that's the truth of it. You can believe it or not. Doesn't change anything for me either way." He didn't wait for a response. He walked down the porch steps and down Maple toward Larkspur, past the diner, past the school, and didn't look back once, though his hands, he noticed once he got home, hadn't fully stopped shaking until he was locking his own front door behind him. Vivian Whitfield did not sleep that night. She'd built a reputation, inherited one, if she was honest with herself, from her father before her, on being the kind of CEO who read every report herself instead of trusting a summary. It was a point of pride. It was also, she realized somewhere around 2 in the morning, a lie, because she had absolutely not read the underlying documentation on Daniel Reyes's termination. She'd been handed a folder by her COO, Marcus Doyle, 11 months ago, with a data breach timeline already assembled, a recommendation already written, and a company 2 quarters away from a public offering that could not afford a security scandal. She'd signed it in 9 minutes between 2 other meetings. She'd trusted Marcus. Marcus had been her father's hire, the man who'd sat with her through 3 brutal years of the company nearly folding, the closest thing she had to family inside those walls. Trusting his judgment on a personnel matter had felt, at the time, like the easiest decision she made all week. Now she sat at her kitchen island with her laptop open, pulling up the archived personnel file for Daniel A. Reyes, and actually reading, for the first time, the technical report attached to his original safety flag. Thermal tolerance readings, batch 4471 through 4489. Deviation from spec, 6.2% above safe threshold under sustained load. Recommendation, halt shipment, full batch recall for retesting. Filed 14 months ago, 3 weeks before the data breach accusation first appeared in his file. Vivian closed the laptop slowly, the way you close something you're afraid might still be alive inside. The next morning, she called her assistant and cleared her calendar for a 9 a.m. meeting she hadn't scheduled with anyone yet, because she needed the hour to figure out who she was even supposed to be meeting with. She started, quietly, with the shipping logs. Batch 4471 through 4489 had gone out on schedule 11 months ago, installed in the Series 4 vehicle line. Nearly 6,000 units on the road right now, in driveways and garages across the country, running on cells that a senior engineer had explicitly flagged as unsafe under sustained thermal load. Her hands were cold by the time she finished cross-referencing the numbers. There had been 2 minor incidents reported in the last 8 months. Vehicle fires, both written off internally as third-party charging equipment failure. Both settled quietly with the owners before either one made local news. Vivian had signed off on both settlements without asking a single follow-up question, because Marcus had told her the equipment failure explanation checked out, and she had believed him the same easy way she'd believed him about Daniel Reyes. She thought about Eleanor's porch, about the muffins, still warm, about a man who had every reason in the world to let those cells keep failing quietly, and instead had spent 7 months bringing an old woman groceries and never once used the leverage he had to make noise about any of it. She picked up her phone and, for the first time in 11 months, typed a message to a number she had absolutely no right to still have saved. "I need to see the original report. All of it. Please." The reply took 4 hours. Why now? She thought about lying. She typed the truth instead. Because I think I fired the only honest person in the building. Daniel almost didn't respond. He sat with his phone on the kitchen counter for the better part of an evening, Mia doing homework at the table behind him, and turned the message over in his mind, like a stone he wasn't sure was worth picking up. 7 months of quiet had taken him this far. A CEO's guilty conscience wasn't his responsibility to manage, but the numbers were his. The report was his, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a small, stubborn part of him, the part that had spent 11 years making sure a company's products didn't hurt anybody, refused to let 6,000 vehicles keep driving around with cells he knew weren't safe, just because he was still angry about how it had ended. He typed back 3 words: tomorrow, not here. They met at a coffee shop 2 towns over, in Cedar Falls, far enough from Millbrook that nobody would recognize either of them, and far enough from Whitfield Dynamics headquarters that nobody would recognize her. Daniel brought a manila folder of his own, copies he'd kept, against every piece of advice a lawyer might have given him, tucked at the back of a filing cabinet for 11 months, because some instinct had told him not to let the paperwork disappear completely. He laid it on the table between them without ceremony. Thermal load charts, emailed timestamps, the internal message thread where his director, a man named Curtis Ames, had told him in writing to hold the flag until after the investor call, 3 days before shipment. Vivian read every page twice. "This isn't what Marcus told me," she said finally, quiet enough that the barista, 2 tables over, didn't look up. "He said you'd access to competitors' proprietary specs through your login and tried to leverage it for a raise. There were screenshots, login timestamps." "There would be," Daniel said, "if someone with admin access wanted to build a case against me after the fact. Check who else had login privileges to my account in the 2 weeks after I filed that report. I never touched a competitor's files in my life. I didn't need to. I had our own data, and it was bad enough." Vivian sat back, and for a long moment, she didn't say anything at all. Daniel watched something settle behind her eyes. Not disbelief anymore, but the particular heavy stillness of someone doing math they didn't want to be doing. "Marcus has admin access to every account in the building," she said slowly. "He's had it since before I was CEO. My father trusted him completely." "And you trusted your father's judgment." "I trusted him," Vivian said, "and there was an edge in it now, aimed inward. For 11 years, I let him run personnel decisions I should have reviewed myself, because it was easier, because he'd never given me a reason not to, because—" She stopped herself. "This doesn't matter. What matters is 6,000 cars are still on the road, with a defect. A report from 14 months ago says we'll fail under sustained load. That's not a personnel problem. That's a recall. That's what I told your director 14 months ago," Daniel said. "He told me to hold the flag. I need everything you have, all of it. And I need you to understand," Vivian said, leaning forward, "that if we do this properly, it's going to get loud. Marcus isn't going to sit quietly while I unwind 11 years of him running interference for himself. He's going to fight, and he's going to fight dirty, because a falsified termination and a buried safety recall is the kind of thing that ends with people going to prison." Daniel thought about Mia, asleep 2 towns away, about the quiet, careful life he'd built, specifically so nobody would ever ask him hard questions again. "I've already lost the version of my life where I get to stay quiet," he said. "I lost it 14 months ago. I just didn't know it yet. There was a longer silence after that. The kind that comes when 2 people who don't fully trust each other yet realize they're about to become dependent on each other anyway." Vivian gathered the pages back into their folder, careful with the edges, the way a person handles something they suddenly understand, is evidence rather than paperwork. There's something else you should know before we go any further, she said. Marcus isn't just my COO. He was my father's closest friend. He stood at my father's funeral and told me, in front of 200 people, that he'd make sure I never had to run this company alone. I believed him. I've believed him about almost everything for 11 years. She looked up. If I'm wrong about what the audit logs are going to show, I need to be wrong quietly before I say a word of this to anyone else. But if I'm right, I need you to understand that the version of him who fought for me after my father died and the version of him who did this to you are, apparently, the same person. I don't know yet how to hold both of those at once. Daniel didn't have an easy answer for that, so he didn't offer one. For what it's worth, he said instead. I don't need him to be a monster for this to be true. People convince themselves of a lot when the alternative is admitting they hurt someone on purpose. Doesn't make it hurt less. Doesn't make you wrong to have trusted him before you had a reason not to. Vivian nodded slowly, and something in her posture eased just slightly, like a person setting down a bag she hadn't realized she was still carrying. I'll pull everything I can without tipping him off, she said. Give me 2 weeks. It took 9 days. They didn't tell Eleanor. Not that week, not the next. Vivian kept driving up to Millbrook on Sundays like always, and Daniel kept bringing muffins 6 evenings a week, and the two of them sat across the kitchen table from a woman who had no idea her granddaughter and her favorite neighbor were quietly building a case against the second most powerful man at Whitfield Dynamics. She's going to be furious we didn't tell her sooner, Vivian said one night on the porch, after Eleanor had gone to bed. She's going to be furious you two have been lying to her about a lot of things, Daniel said, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed Vivian's face before she caught it and put it away again. Back at headquarters, Vivian moved carefully. She requested a full internal audit of the Series 4 battery line under the cover of a routine quality review, the kind of thing a CEO could order without raising immediate alarm. She pulled admin access logs from the 2 weeks after Daniel's original report, going back through a system Marcus had built and trusted nobody would ever look at twice. What she found made her sick to her stomach. Marcus Doyle had logged into Daniel's account 4 times in the 11 days between the safety flag and the termination letter. He'd planted the fabricated screenshots himself. He'd drafted the breach accusation 2 full days before he'd claimed to have discovered it. And buried in an email thread from 14 months ago, one line from Marcus to Curtis Ames that made the whole thing click into place with the cold, final sound of a door locking. Handle Reyes quietly. If this goes public before the IPO, we lose the company. I don't care how you make the flag disappear. Make it disappear. Vivian sat alone in her office long after the building had emptied out, staring at that sentence, and understood that whatever came next couldn't happen behind closed doors with lawyers managing the language. It had to happen in front of the people who'd spent 11 months believing a lie because a signature told them to. Her signature. Marcus Doyle had been expecting a routine quarterly check-in when Vivian called the meeting. He walked into the boardroom Thursday morning with his usual easy confidence. The confidence of a man who had never once considered that the ground under him might not hold, and took his seat at the long table without noticing that 4 board members were already there, or that Vivian had a folder in front of her instead of her tablet. "What's this about?" he asked, settling in. Vivian didn't waste time. She laid the printed emails across the table one by one, letting each board member read in silence before she said a word. 14 months ago, she said, Daniel Reyes flagged a thermal tolerance failure on the Series 4 battery line. 3 weeks later, Marcus began building a termination case against him, not for the tolerance failure, but for a data breach that never happened. "This is absurd," Marcus said, too fast. "You're taking the word of a disgruntled ex-employee and turning it into a conspiracy." "I'm taking the word of your own login activity," Vivian said, and slid the audit log across the table. 4 sessions on his account, in the 11 days before his termination. Time-stamped, logged automatically by a system you built and apparently forgot tracks its own administrators. The room went very still. Marcus's composure cracked for the first time in 11 years of Vivian knowing him. A flush climbed up from his collar. "You want to talk about disgruntled," he said, voice low now, aimed at Vivian alone. "How's it going to look when the board finds out their CEO has been having dinner every Sunday with the man she fired at her own grandmother's house? Careful whose credibility you're spending, Vivian." "Mine's already spent," Vivian said, standing. "I signed that termination letter in 9 minutes without reading the report underneath it. I own that. What I won't own is 6,000 vehicles on the road with a defect you buried to protect an IPO timeline." The boardroom door opened. Daniel stepped in, still in his work jacket, a folder of his own tucked under one arm. Nobody had invited him, but Vivian had told him where and when, and he'd made his own decision about whether to come. "I have the original report," he said, setting it beside Marcus's fabricated file without raising his voice. "Filed the same week as the batch shipment. Every data point in it matches what your own engineers confirmed in the audit this week, before someone told them 14 months ago to stop asking questions." Marcus's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "You built a case against the one person who did his job correctly," Vivian said, addressing the room now rather than Marcus alone. "I'd like the board to vote on Marcus Doyle's immediate suspension, pending a full internal and external safety review, and I'd like to open communication with regulators on the Series 4 recall before another vehicle fire happens instead of after." The vote was not close. Marcus was escorted from the building within the hour, his access revoked before he reached the parking garage, his protests trailing down a hallway nobody stopped to watch. Daniel stood by the boardroom window afterward, watching afternoon light spill across a company that had once been the center of his whole professional life, and felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in almost a year. Not triumph exactly. The quiet relief of finally being believed. Vivian crossed the room and stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Thank you," she said, "for coming. I didn't do it for you," Daniel said, though there was no edge in it now. "I did it because 6,000 people are driving cars with a defect in them, and because it was true." "I know," Vivian said. "That's exactly why it mattered." The recall was announced within the week. Voluntary, transparent. Every affected vehicle brought in for a full battery replacement at company cost. 2 engineering firms were brought in to independently verify the original thermal data. Both confirmed Daniel's findings down to the decimal, 14 months late. Vivian called a full staff meeting on a Friday morning. The auditorium filled past capacity, for the first time anyone at headquarters could remember. She didn't read from notes. 14 months ago, she said, her voice steady, though her hands weren't. This company fired a man for telling the truth. Daniel Reyes found a safety failure that could have put lives at risk, reported it exactly as he was trained to, and was punished for it by someone protecting a stock price instead of our customers. I signed that termination. I own that mistake. Publicly. In front of all of you. She found Daniel near the back of the room, arms crossed, Mia's latest horse drawing folded in his jacket pocket, though nobody in that room but him knew that detail. I'm offering Mr. Reyes his position back, she said, at a senior level, reflecting the 14 months this company owes him, along with full back pay and a formal correction to his record. But more than that, I'm asking the board to make what he did policy. Every safety flag gets independent review before termination is even considered. We don't bury the people who tell us the truth. Not again. The applause that followed wasn't performative. It came from engineers who'd worked beside Daniel for a decade and never understood why he'd disappeared. From people who'd quietly wondered whether raising a safety flag of their own would cost them the same way it had cost him. For the first time in 14 months, the answer to that question had changed, in front of all of them, at once. Daniel hadn't expected the applause, and it took the room going quiet again before he trusted himself to speak. "I'm not saying yes today," he told Vivian afterward, in the emptying hallway near the elevators. "I need time. 14 months doesn't undo itself because of one good meeting." "I know," Vivian said. "Take whatever time you need." He nodded, and for a moment neither of them moved toward the door. Somewhere behind them, the parking garage lights flickered on, one by one, as the afternoon slid toward evening, and neither one seemed in any particular hurry to be the first to walk toward their car. That evening, they drove to Maple Street separately and arrived within minutes of each other, standing on Eleanor's porch under the same light where all of this had technically started, neither one performing anything anymore. "I think it's time we told her the truth," Vivian said quietly, hand resting on the doorframe. "All of it." Daniel looked at the yellow door, then at her. "Yeah," he said. "I think you're right." He knocked once, out of habit. Though the door was already unlocked, Eleanor listened to the whole story without interrupting, which, for Eleanor, was its own kind of miracle. She heard about the report, the termination, the 14 months of silence, the muffin deliveries that had started as an accident of routine and turned into something neither of them had planned on giving. She heard about the audit log, the boardroom, the vote. When they finished, she sat back in her recliner and was quiet long enough that Vivian started to worry. Then Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, one hand pressed to her chest. "So this whole time," she said, "you two have been sitting at my table, lying to an old woman's face about how you met." "Not lying exactly," Vivian started. "Lying," Eleanor said, delighted rather than offended. "Bless you both. I've been telling everyone at church what a lovely coincidence it was. My granddaughter, and the nice young man from down the street." She shook her head, still smiling. "Well, I suppose it still is a lovely coincidence. Just a different kind than I thought." In the weeks that followed, the evenings at Eleanor's house stopped needing a script. Vivian showed up without warning texts, without excuses, simply because she wanted to. Daniel stopped watching his words so carefully around her. What was left, once the pretending fell away, was something neither of them had expected to find on a stranger's porch, in a town neither of them had grown up in. Daniel took the recall project as a contractor first. Not the full reinstatement, not yet, but close enough to put his old certifications back to work, reviewing the replacement battery cells personally, line by line, the way he should have been allowed to 14 months earlier. Mia started drawing a new kind of picture, a kitchen table with 4 chairs instead of 2, and a 5th figure with white hair, who she insisted on calling the Muffin Lady's grandma, even after everyone had gently corrected her 3 or 4 times. The formal charges against Marcus Doyle took longer: data fraud, falsification of internal records, obstruction related to a federal vehicle safety investigation that had opened the moment Whitfield Dynamics self-reported the defect. Daniel testified once, calmly, with the same careful precision Eleanor used to tease him about across her kitchen table. He didn't enjoy it. He didn't need to. It simply needed to be true, and he said what was true, and then he went home to make dinner for his daughter. 6 months after the door on Maple Street had opened onto the last person he expected to see, Daniel Reyes signed his reinstatement paperwork at a small desk, with a view of the parking garage where he'd once carried a cardboard box of his own belongings out of a building that no longer wanted him. Vivian sat across from him while he signed it, not as his CEO in that moment, just as the person who'd finally read the report she should have read 14 months earlier. "Welcome back," she said. "Ask me again in a year," Daniel said, but he was smiling when he said it. And outside the window, 6,000 replacement battery cells were already rolling off a corrected production line, tested twice, signed off by an engineer nobody had ever needed to silence in the first place. Reinstatement wasn't the ending Daniel expected it to feel like. He'd pictured, somewhere in the back of his mind over 14 quiet months, a moment of vindication that would feel like a door slamming shut on the worst year of his life. Instead, it felt like stepping back into a house that was almost exactly how he'd left it, except every hallway now had a slightly different weight to it, a wariness that hadn't existed before. His old co-workers welcomed him back carefully, the way people welcome someone home from a war they didn't have to fight themselves, with genuine warmth, tangled up with a guilt they didn't quite know how to name. Priya Anand, an engineer who'd sat 2 desks down from him for 6 years and gone quiet during the worst week of his termination, found him alone in the break room his second day back. "I should have said something," she told him, not quite meeting his eyes. "When it happened, I read your report before you filed it. I knew the numbers were bad. Curtis made it sound like there was more to the story. I let myself believe there was more to the story, because it was easier than believing my company would bury something like that." Daniel thought about all the ways he could answer that. He picked the honest one instead of the easy one. "You're not the one who buried it," he said. "You don't owe me an apology for believing the people who were supposed to be trustworthy. That's what trust is supposed to feel like. It's not your fault they broke it. It wasn't absolution exactly, and he didn't offer it as such." But something in Priya's shoulders loosened, and over the following weeks, she became the first real ally he had back in the building. Someone who double-checked his data without being asked, who sat in on his review meetings, and made sure nobody quietly slid the same kind of pressure onto him that had cost him his job the first time. Curtis Ames, his old director, did not fare as well. The internal investigation into the falsified breach accusation implicated him directly. The email instructing Daniel to hold the flag until after the investor call became, once regulators got involved, a central piece of evidence in the federal case. Curtis resigned before the board could vote on termination, which everyone in the building understood to be a distinction without much of a difference. Vivian handled the fallout with a steadiness that surprised even her own board. She gave 2 public statements, sat for 1 deposition, and turned down every request for a television interview that wanted the story to be about her personally, rather than about 6,000 families whose vehicles were now safer, because one engineer had refused to let a bad number quietly disappear. "They want the redemption story," she told Daniel one evening on Eleanor's porch, turning her phone face down on the railing after declining another interview request. "CEO admits mistake, makes it right. Everybody claps. It's a good story. I just don't think it's the story that matters most here." "Which one does?" "The one where a man got fired for doing his job correctly, and it took someone with my last name almost getting killed in a defective car for anybody senior enough to care to actually look at the report." Vivian's jaw tightened. "That's not a redemption story. That's an indictment. I'd rather the company sit with that than let people feel good about how it ended." Daniel didn't have an answer for that, so he didn't try to give her one. He just sat with her on the porch step until the streetlights came on, the way he'd sat with Eleanor 100 evenings before any of this had a name. Eleanor, for her part, had opinions about all of it, delivered with the particular bluntness reserved for people who have buried a husband and outlived most of their patience for nonsense. You two have been circling each other for 6 months, like a pair of teenagers, she told them both over Sunday dinner, not even bothering to look up from her green beans. I'd like grandchildren before I'm too old to spoil them properly, if it's not too much trouble. Grandma, Vivian said, mortified. I'm 79, Vivian. I've earned the right to be embarrassing. Eleanor finally looked up, and her expression softened into something gentler than the teasing suggested. I watched that man walk up my porch steps every single evening for 7 months, before either of you told me who he really was. I don't need a written report to know a good one when I feed him dinner 6 nights a week. Mia, who had been allowed to join Sunday dinners once the truth came out, piped up from the end of the table. Are you going to marry the lady, Dad? Daniel nearly choked on his water. Vivian went bright red. Eleanor laughed so hard she had to set down her fork. We're taking it slow, Bug, Daniel managed. That's what grown-ups say when they mean yes, eventually, Mia said, with the devastating confidence of an 8-year-old who has clearly given this more thought than either adult at the table, and went back to her horse, drawing, like she hadn't just derailed the entire dinner. Priya became something close to a fixture at those Sunday dinners too, eventually, though it took her longer to accept an invitation than either Daniel or Vivian expected. It was Daniel who finally asked her directly, over coffee in the break room, why she kept turning down a free meal. Because I still feel like I don't belong at that table, Priya admitted. You forgave me too easily for staying quiet. I'm not sure I've forgiven myself yet. Nobody's asking you to earn a seat at Eleanor's table, Daniel said. She'll feed anybody who shows up hungry. That's kind of the whole point of her. But if it helps, staying on my review team, catching the things the old system would have buried, that's not you earning forgiveness. That's just you doing good work. Those don't have to be the same thing. She came to dinner the following Sunday, brought a lopsided pie that Eleanor declared, with visible affection, the worst pie I've eaten since the war, and you're welcome back any time, and slowly became someone Mia addressed with the easy familiarity of family, rather than the careful politeness of a stranger. The federal investigation into Whitfield dynamics stretched into its 4th month before the Department of Transportation finalized its findings. The Series 4 recall had been handled correctly once initiated, but the 14-month delay between the original safety flag and the company's self-report constituted a serious violation, resulting in a settlement large enough to make headlines on its own, separate from Marcus Doyle's ongoing criminal case. Vivian didn't fight the settlement. She authorized it within a week of the finding, over the objections of 2 board members who wanted to negotiate the number down. We put people at risk for 14 months to protect a stock price, she told the board. I'm not interested in negotiating what that's worth. The settlement came with mandated changes. An independent safety ombudsman position, reporting directly to the board rather than through the executive chain that had failed so completely the first time. Vivian created the position and then offered it to Daniel. It's not the same job you had before, she told him, sitting across from him in her office, the door open. She'd started leaving it open more, he'd noticed, since Marcus. You'd report to the board, not to me, not to any director. Any safety flag you raise gets independent review before anyone can act on it. Terminate anyone, bury anything. You'd have the authority nobody gave you the first time. Daniel turned the folder over in his hands, reading through the position outline twice. Why me? Because you're the only person in this building who's ever proven he won't let a bad number stay quiet, even when it cost him everything. Vivian leaned forward. I'm not offering you this because of Eleanor, or because of anything between us. I'm offering it because it's true, and because this company needs someone in that chair who's already shown he can't be pressured into silence. He took the job. Priya became his deputy, The first person in the building whose job it was to make sure no safety flag ever again disappeared into a director's inbox with a note to hold it until after an investor call. The first 18 months of the new Safety Review Board caught 11 issues that would previously have gone unreported. 2 were serious enough that the old system would very likely have buried them the same way it had buried Daniel's original report. Both were resolved within weeks instead of over a year, because the person reviewing them had absolutely nothing to lose by telling the truth, and everything to lose by staying silent. Not everyone in Millbrook knew the whole story. Eleanor's neighbors knew a version, that Daniel had gotten a promotion at his old company, that he and the CEO had started dating, that Eleanor had somehow ended up with the best possible outcome for a woman whose only real complaint about her granddaughter had been that she didn't visit enough. That complaint solved itself. Vivian started driving up to Millbrook 2, sometimes 3 times a week, and eventually stopped counting it as a drive at all, because she kept a spare set of clothes in Daniel's closet and a toothbrush in his bathroom, and Mia had started drawing her into every family picture without anyone asking her to. It was Eleanor who found the piece none of them had known was still missing, nearly a year after the door on Maple Street had opened onto the wrong footsteps. She was going through a box of old photographs one Sunday afternoon, looking for a picture of her late husband to show Mia, when she pulled out a faded print from almost 40 years earlier. Her husband, young, standing outside a factory building with 2 other men in hard hats, all 3 of them grinning at the camera. "That's the old Whitfield manufacturing plant," Eleanor said, tapping the photo. "Before it was Whitfield Dynamics. Before any of the battery business. My husband ran quality control there for 22 years. Refused to let a bad part leave that building, not once, not for anybody. Cost him a promotion or 2, I imagine, though he never complained about it to me." Vivian went very still, looking at the photograph. "I didn't know Grandpa worked in quality control. Nobody talks about it much," Eleanor said. "It wasn't glamorous work, but your grandfather used to say the whole company only meant anything if the people building it could trust what left the building was safe. He'd be furious about what happened to Daniel here. Furious." She looked up at Daniel with something unexpectedly fierce in her expression. "You'd have gotten along with him. Same stubborn streak about doing a thing right, even when it costs you." Vivian sat with that for a long moment, the photograph in her hands, understanding for the first time that the principal Daniel had nearly lost everything defending wasn't some abstract corporate value she'd inherited from a business school textbook. It was something her own grandfather had built into the company's foundation, decades before anyone had shortened his name down to a logo on a stock ticker. She had the photograph framed and hung it in the safety ombudsman's office the following week, without telling Daniel first. He found it Monday morning, read the small brass plate underneath. Frank Whitfield, Quality Control, 1971 to 1993. The building only stands if what leaves it can be trusted, and sat with it for longer than he meant to before Priya found him there and gently steered him back to the morning's review meeting. The company culture didn't change overnight, and Vivian never pretended it did in any of the internal town halls she held quarterly now, a practice she'd started the same month as the recall and never let herself skip, even when the news was uncomfortable. But something measurable did shift. Anonymous safety reporting submissions to Daniel's office tripled in the first year. Not because more things were going wrong, employees said in exit surveys, but because for the first time, people believed a flag wouldn't quietly end their career. Marcus Doyle's trial concluded 14 months after the boardroom confrontation, with a conviction on fraud and obstruction charges that came with a sentence long enough that Vivian, when asked about it by a reporter afterward, declined to comment beyond a single sentence. The system that let one person bury a safety report for over a year is the thing that actually needed fixing. His sentence doesn't fix that. Our new policies are what fixes that. 2 years to the month after Daniel first knocked on Eleanor's yellow door with a soccer ball apology in hand, he stood on that same porch in a rented suit that fit slightly wrong across the shoulders, watching Mia, now 10, gap tooth long since grown in, walk down a makeshift aisle of folding chairs, scattering rose petals with the fierce concentration of a child who had rehearsed this exact walk 11 times and was not going to mess it up now. Eleanor sat in the front row in her Sunday best, cane resting against her knee, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and pretending, unconvincingly, that it was just allergies. Vivian walked down after Mia in a dress the color of the porch light that had been burning the evening this whole story began, and Daniel found, standing there in front of a small crowd of people who'd become something like family without either of them planning for it, that he didn't have a single carefully rehearsed thing to say. He'd spent 2 years being precise for a living. In this one moment, he let it go. "I used to think the worst thing that ever happened to me was getting fired," he said, when it was his turn. "Losing everything I thought I'd built. Standing in a parking garage with a cardboard box, not knowing how I was going to explain any of it to my daughter." He looked at Mia, then at Eleanor, then finally at Vivian. "It took me a long time to understand that losing that job was also the reason I ended up on this porch in the first place. I'm not going to pretend I'd choose to go through it again, but I wouldn't trade where it led me for anything." Eleanor, from the front row, loudly blew her nose into the handkerchief and said, at a volume clearly meant to be heard, "Well, get on with it then. I'm not getting any younger." And the whole porch dissolved into laughter, exactly the way she'd intended. Vivian's vows were shorter than Daniel expected, and steadier than she'd sounded rehearsing them the night before in the kitchen, pacing between the stove and the table while Daniel pretended to review paperwork so she wouldn't feel watched. "I spent a long time believing that trusting the wrong person was a private failure," she said. "Something I had to fix quietly, on my own, before anyone noticed. You taught me that the fix isn't private at all. It's showing up 6 evenings a week, with muffins, for no reason except that it was the right thing to do, whether or not anybody was watching, whether or not it ever paid you back." She glanced at Eleanor, then back at Daniel. "It paid you back anyway. I hope you know that. I hope I get to keep being part of the payment for the rest of both our lives." The scent of Eleanor's rose bed drifted across the yard on the evening air, mixed with candle wax and the sugar and butter smell of Priya's slightly lopsided cake cooling on a side table. And somewhere near the back, a few of Daniel's old co-workers from the maintenance company stood shoulder to shoulder with engineers from Whitfield Dynamics, 2 entirely different lives folded together into one backyard, because neither of them had ever fully let go of the other. The reception was small. Eleanor's backyard, string lights, that lopsided cake, and a folder that Vivian handed Daniel quietly near the end of the night, away from the noise of the party. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside was a single framed document, the original safety report, the one he'd filed 14 months before his termination, the one that had started all of it. Vivian had had it professionally restored and matted, the coffee stain from the night he'd first pulled it from his old files, carefully preserved rather than removed. "I wanted you to have the original," she said, "not a copy. The one that mattered. I know it doesn't undo the year you lost. I'm not trying to pretend it does. I just wanted you to have proof, permanently, in your own house, that you were right the entire time, even when nobody with power was willing to say so." Daniel looked at it for a long moment. The numbers, the timestamp, the careful, precise handwriting of a younger version of himself who'd had no idea what it was about to cost him. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way that went considerably deeper than the 2 words could carry. Eleanor passed peacefully 3 years later, in the same recliner where she'd listened, without interrupting, to the whole complicated truth of how her granddaughter and her favorite neighbor had actually met. Daniel and Vivian were both there, along with Mia, 13 by then and quieter than usual, and Vivian's father, who had flown in from overseas the moment he heard. The funeral was small, exactly as Eleanor would have wanted it, and afterward the family gathered on the porch of the yellow house on Maple Street, a house that had, by unspoken agreement over the last several years, simply become the place everyone gathered, regardless of whose name was technically on the deed. Vivian sat on the porch steps that evening, the same steps where she and Daniel had stood the night they finally told Eleanor the truth, and found herself thinking about a small, strange chain of accidents that had led here: a soccer ball into a rose bed, a granddaughter's guilty phone call habits, a laminated badge wedged behind old insurance papers, an audit log nobody expected an admin to forget existed. "She'd be glad it turned out like this," Daniel said, sitting down beside her, Mia curled against his other side. "All of it. Not just us. The company, the policy changes, Priya's whole department now. She used to say you worked too hard for what, exactly. I think she'd say this was the what. She'd also say I took entirely too long to notice a good man was standing on her porch every evening for months before I did anything useful about it," Vivian said. And it was the kind of grief that could still, even on the worst day, make room for a small laugh. They sat there as the porch light clicked on above them in the gathering dark, the same pale bulb Daniel had changed 100 times over the years, replaced now with a longer-lasting version he'd installed himself, on Eleanor's insistence. "So you two don't have to keep doing this every single month, for heaven's sake." Inside the house, now legally left to both of them in Eleanor's will, with an instruction that made the estate lawyer visibly emotional reading it aloud, "To the two people who found each other on my porch, and to my great-granddaughter, who I hope draws many more pictures of this kitchen table." Mia's newest horse drawing was already taped to the refrigerator, 5 figures around a table now instead of 2, every one of them with the same suspiciously human eyes Eleanor used to tease her about. Daniel reached over and took Vivian's hand on the porch step, the way he had 100 small times before without either of them ever quite naming it, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. They didn't need to. The door behind them was open, the light was on, and for the first time in longer than either of them could easily remember, nobody standing on that porch had anything left to hide.